Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video, and today we're going to change the way you think about highlighting. Let's get into it.
The strict technomancer that is Vincey V. Let us get to the technique and learn it, Vincey V.
So this is part 3 of my series on painting the new Dark Elf from the Deogard Kickstarter from Cult of Paint. If you haven't watched the first two, hey, go check those out after you're done here. Today we're focusing in on the back side of the miniature. Now, when I did the front, he was in the reflected sort of bright halo of light of the High Elf in part 1. However, today we need to get much colder. This is the Dark Elf's normal tone. So today I'm going to show you how I paint and attack something that's in a more nighttime, cold light, moonlight type scene. So, and we're going to really disrupt a lot of the way we think about highlighting. Let's head over to the desk. Let's get painting. All right, we're going to start with the armor. Now, this is the same base purple mix as I used on the front, and that's the first key. When you're thinking about shifting the highlight of things, you don't necessarily need to change all of your colors. So I'm still using the same violets. The trick is, instead of working with a something like warm, like the warm flesh or the peachy colors that I was using on the front side, or even ice yellow, instead here on the back I'm going to use turquoise, a blue-green. And it's not actually very bright, but in the context of this overall composition, it will feel quite bright. And so that's the next thing I want to say about highlighting is I think oftentimes when we highlight, we see it as just, it has to be this progression up into really high values. Whites, near whites, ice yellows, pastels, all those kinds of things. Here, none of that is going to appear, and yet the figure will still be quite effectively highlighted. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a lot less of the higher value purple. So I still use it, but I use it in different combinations. So you'll watch here as I layer up that I'm using less of it, and instead focusing more on introducing the blue-green, which is a very turquoise, a bright turquoise color, but still a turquoise color, into the darker purple or a slight mix of the two purples. And what that lets me then do is create still quite a value contrast, but we're going much lower with everything else. So my natural shadows are still that extremely, extremely dark purple, maybe even a little tiny bit of black mixed in, but it allows me to go up to this really nice blue highlight. And really you can do this with kind of any sort of bright, semi-high value color. The most common two we often work in tend to be something like yellows, so that read that as like a warm flesh tone or an ice yellow or something like that, because we want to capture a warm scene. But we can just as easily shift ourselves over using something like blue-green to create a more nighttime, cold, winter-infused scene. In any of those things, if you're trying to highlight your miniature and you want it to feel like it's in moonlight, like it's in a winter scene, you're going to put some frost or snow all over the base, like you want all of those things to be colder, then simply going to something like a blue-green can be a great play. Now, why I like something like turquoise and a blue-green as opposed to, say, why not just pick a bright blue or a white blue, is because I also want this to be somewhat shadowed. If you really are trying to still paint like a cold but bright scene, then you would go from this blue-green into a white-blue, something like what's in my set from Monument Hobbies. So, as I continue, you can see I just layer up here, and then in the end I come back and glaze some of that actual mid-tone purple over to kind of bring it all together. But the focus here around each of these purple elements is just around making sure that we have that cold highlight in place. As long as the value is higher, it's still going to feel like a highlight. So I can shift my whole spectrum down. I don't have to run everything from like black to white to still make it feel like it has the appropriate amount of contrast. I can slide the whole spectrum down, make the mid-tone and base colors darker, lower value to start, and that'll make something that's not very bright still feel very bright in comparison. All right, the next big piece we've got to talk about is the non-metallic metal. Now, on the front, I did basically everything with two colors, a Payne's gray and an ice yellow, and just kind of transitioned between them. Job's a good one. No fuss, no muss. Here on the backside though, we got to shift those highlights and make them more cold. We got to bring them into that colder environment. So what we're going to do is again go to that blue-green. And in fact, that's going to be the color, that turquoise, that I'm universally using to represent the colder, darker temperature. It's of a lower value than a traditional white, so it makes the scene feel more shadowed, but still creates the highlights, like I talked about with the armor. We're still going to need a little bit of that ice yellow, though. We can't rely solely on that, as we did with the armor, because we're dealing with a different material. The non-metallic metal is shiny. It's reflective, right? So it's going to have higher value areas on it than what the more matte leather armor would have. Okay, so what we do here is we begin, instead of just, going straight to ice yellow, we take that Payne's Gray and mix in some of the blue-green. We then begin to work that up until we're basically dealing in pure blue-green. Then I add just small amounts of the ice yellow to up the value on that, still definitely leaving it infused by that blue-green, which makes my highlights very cold. I don't really use much of any pure ice yellow. The highest mix from my tiny, tiny, tiny specular highlights and edge highlights, basically anything where they're supposed to be pure light reflecting, is still about 10-20% blue-green, and then the rest ice yellow. Once again, I do vary this over the entire surface. So I still have to modulate the light and make sure it's following the patterns I laid down with the armor. Just like I talked about back in part 1, when you're trying to figure out where to highlight non-metallic metal, if you've already highlighted other parts of the miniature and created shafts of light or how the light travels, you're going to then follow those same light lines and create those highlights there, or vice versa. Light moves in these columns and shafts, right? And so you want to think about that and have, if you've got a reflection on the armor, it needs to carry through to the metal. So I continue to sort of work all this around, and good Lord, there is a lot of that metal. Boy, oh boy. But I work my way around this thing, again, following that same pattern, going mostly into the blue-green, and then, or the turquoise, as it were, and then finally bringing in just a little bit of the ice yellow until I get to a tiny specular dot highlight or an edge highlight. With that out of the way, I then turn to some other key areas. So we've got to hit the hair. That's an important element here. The hair is necessary for me to sort of catch some of that blue in there, and I want to kick a little more of it up. The hair itself is very satin. This hair is kind of crazy, the way it's super long and like whipping around and stuff. So we put some of that in there, and I kind of, again, this is the same technique as I've always done for hair. This really isn't a hair painting tutorial, though I do have a lot of those in the playlist if you're curious. And yet again, because it's satin, I do infuse a tiny amount of the ice yellow in there to catch that high reflection, even though I'm going to glaze most of it back down in the end. But building up the highlights in the hair is just a matter of doing a lot of very sharp, very thin lines repeatedly and modulating them back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's mind-numbing, but it is, I don't know, I suppose like rewarding, because in the end I do think it produces a cool effect. Once I've got those two sort of primary areas sketched out with the blue and got them in there, I do some refinement off camera, but the basic premise remains the same as what I'm doing here. I'm just getting in smaller with my little sexy gogs, making sure that I can see all of the detail and really pick out those individual hairs. Remember, the key when you're working with hair is that in your highlight spot, your lowest shadows are your midtone. So remember that value spectrum movement. When we're there in the bright spots, we've got to bring even the recesses up to the midtone. And then as we spread out, that's when we reintroduce those deepest shadows. So with those three sort of primary areas done, that's really most of the elements we needed to worry about here on this thing resolved. From there, it's just a little more additional cleanup. I do go through some of these other elements, touch up things that I had previously missed. I end up doing the weapon because it had broken off, as I'm sure you noticed at some point in this series. I do end up replacing the weapon and doing that as well. There again, I end up sort of using the two metals on both sides, where the light-facing side has a little bit more warmth to it, and the cold-facing side a little bit less. So I think one of the keys that I want to impress upon you with this is that when you're highlighting, you don't have to run to white or a near white or a bright color. You can play around with these other tones. Here I'm doing it with blue, but you can do the same thing depending on the piece with an orange or even a yellow or a yellow ochre. All of those could be completely valid and will create different lighting situations. The orange or yellow ochre is going to make somebody feel like they're sitting in torchlight, right? Depending on how else you colored the scene. So there's just lots of options for how you want to take these highlights, and it can overall really dramatically make the piece feel more like it's a credible part of the environment. I will say a side benefit of using these sorts of mid-tone values as your highlights, as I'm doing here to capture, sort of the cold shadow this character actually lives in, is that they blend a lot easier and are a lot more naturally transparent and easier to work with than traditional whites and near whites. So if you've been struggling with that, think about switching to some of these other paints and giving it a try. Maybe set a scene near of your figure in torchlight, or on a very warm golden hour type sunny day, or maybe in the ice and snow like I'm doing here on a sort of cloudy afternoon. Whatever you think or try, I hope this did help you do so. Of course, for me, there's one more thing I've got to do. Hey, John.
Hey.
I've got a present for you. It's work. Here you go. That's my half done. The Dark Elf is ready to go. Now I hand this project over to you.
Work.
Work, yes. Now you have to do the other half.
My favorite kind of gift.
Isn't that exciting? Right when you're working on your Golden Demon project, now you get to do this other display figure.
Well, I at least have something that I know I have a bar that I can easily climb over. So
absolutely. I look forward to seeing you fail to cross it. Enjoy. So there you go. John's got the miniature, and it's up to him now. He has my mini. It's off. It's back with him in Minnesota. And he's going to be painting the High Elf side. So make sure you head over to Ninjon's channel and check out how he's going to work with what I've already done to see to get the High Elf side painted and complete the duel. As I said, this is all part of the awesome Kickstarter from Cult of Paint. If you want more information on that, check that out down in the description below. Those guys are awesome, and these figures are really fantastic. So they were very, very fun to paint for sure. Linkies down in the description. But if you liked this, give it a like. Subscribe for additional hobby cheating in the future. We have new videos here every Saturday. If you've got questions about this kind of alternative highlighting scheme I didn't answer, drop those down in the comments below. I always answer every question asked. If you want to support the channel, lots of ways you can do so. There are affiliate links down there. Don't cost you anything extra. In fact, they often save you money and are a great way to pick up your hobby supplies and help the channel at the same time. It's really appreciated. There's also, of course, the books I write with Uncle Adam down there. Check those out. And of course, there's our Patreon, focused on review and feedback and taking your next step on your hobby journey. As always, though, I thank you so much for watching this one, and we'll see you next time.